The church was nearly silent, except for the faint rustle of coats and the shuffling of feet as people gathered their belongings after the service. For Anna, every sound felt magnified, pressing against the fragile wall she had built to hold herself together. She kept her head down, not daring to meet anyone's gaze. The air felt heavier inside than it did outside in the cold winter wind, yet she longed for the fresh bite of the air, anything to escape the suffocating atmosphere around her. She had been coming here for years, sitting in the same wooden pew, singing the same hymns, greeting the same faces. But today, the warmth she once found here had vanished. In its place was a wall of cold stares, whispers that didn't even try to hide, and the gnawing feeling that she no longer belonged. The reason was simple but brutal. People talked, and they had decided her story for her. No one had asked for the truth. No one had listened. Her hands clutched the strap of her worn leather bag, the skin around her knuckles pale from the grip. She took a deep breath, tasting the faint scent of incense still hanging in the air. The pastor was speaking quietly to someone at the front, his voice low, the kind of voice that carried comfort to others. Others, not her. She had already decided she wouldn't look back once she walked out. Each step toward the tall wooden doors seemed longer than the last. Memories clung to her with every movement. Baptisms, weddings, holidays, laughter in the fellowship hall. But those memories belonged to a different version of her, a version who hadn't been marked by mistakes she couldn't erase. She could already feel the sting of tears in her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall until she was outside. She reached for the cold brass handle of the door. Her breath trembled as she prepared to push it open. And then, through the heavy silence, a voice rose, steady but urgent, calling her name. Anna. It was the pastor, and something in the way he said it made her freeze, her fingers still on the door handle. Anna's heart skipped, the sound of her name pulling her back like an invisible thread. She turned slightly, hesitant, as if unsure whether she truly wanted to face the weight in that voice. The entire sanctuary seemed to pause with her. Conversation stopped. Coats that were halfway into sleeves remained frozen. The warmth of the sunlight streaming through the tall stained glass windows painted the aisle in fractured colors, but it felt as if all light had narrowed to the place where she stood. The pastor took a step forward from the pulpit, his eyes fixed on hers. His expression wasn't one of judgment or reprimand. It was something deeper. There was recognition there, a quiet ache that seemed to mirror the one she carried. For a moment, she wanted to believe that maybe he saw more than the rumors and the shame. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't an order either. It was the kind of tone that left no room for running. Anna swallowed hard. Every instinct told her to leave before the eyes of the congregation devoured her with curiosity, before the whispers multiplied. Yet something in his voice had cut through the armor she had wrapped around herself. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she let go of the door handle. The sound of her boots against the old wooden floor echoed in the stillness as she walked back down the aisle. Each step felt heavier, her pulse quickening with the awareness that every person in the room was watching. But when she reached the front, the pastor didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached out his hand. Not to shake hers, but to steady her, like someone offering a lifeline. His hand was warm against her cold fingers, grounding her in the moment. And then, with the gentlest firmness, he said words she never expected to hear in front of everyone. "You are not leaving this place like this." The weight of the sentence settled over her, not as a burden, but as an invitation she couldn't yet understand. For a moment, Anna could only stare at him, her mind scrambling to understand what he meant. The pastor's voice had been calm, but it carried a certainty that disarmed her. Around them, the congregation remained seated, the tension thick enough to feel in the air. She wanted to retreat, to ask him to let her go, but the firmness in his gaze kept her rooted in place. He gestured toward the first pew, silently inviting her to sit. Anna hesitated. She didn't want to sit there, exposed to the eyes of the entire room. But something inside whispered that maybe this was the reason she had been called back. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the worn wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The pastor stepped back, his voice rising so everyone could hear, but his words were still directed at her. "Sometimes," he began, "we convince ourselves that walking away will protect us, that if we leave, the pain will stay behind. But the truth is, pain follows. It follows until it is faced." Anna's chest tightened. She didn't like where this was going. She felt every eye on her, felt the weight of their silent questions. Yet there was something in his words that dug beneath her defenses, something that made her want to listen despite herself. "I don't know what you've been told," he continued, "but I do know this. You are not your past. You are not defined by the mistakes you've made or the ones others believe you've made. You belong here, and no one, not even your own fear, has the right to take that from you." The words struck her harder than she expected. She hadn't realized until now how desperately she needed to hear them. The room seemed to blur at the edges, her vision stinging with unshed tears. And then, for the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest shift inside her, a crack in the wall she had built, letting in a sliver of light. The silence that followed his words was almost louder than the sermon itself. Anna sat there, her hands still locked together, feeling the thud of her heartbeat in her ears. The congregation seemed frozen, as if afraid that even a cough might break the fragile moment unfolding before them. She wanted to respond, but her throat felt tight, as if every word she could say had been locked away for too long. She glanced at the people sitting nearby, faces she had known for years, now a mix of curiosity, hesitation, and something she couldn't quite name. Were they beginning to see her differently? Or were they simply waiting for her to defend herself? The pastor walked closer, standing beside her now rather than speaking from a distance. His presence felt steady, unshakable, like an anchor in a storm. He didn't look at the others. He kept his focus entirely on her, as though this moment was between them alone. "You've been carrying this weight alone for too long," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "Whatever happened, whatever was said, you don't have to keep running from it." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She thought about the countless nights she had lain awake, replaying conversations, wishing she could rewrite them. She thought about how exhausting it had been to pretend she was fine when she wasn't. And yet, admitting that out loud felt terrifying. The pastor extended his hand again, palm open, patient. "Stand with me," he said gently. "Not to explain yourself, not to defend yourself, just to stand, so you can see that you're not alone here." For a moment she didn't move. But then something in her, something tired of the shadows, made her take his hand. The warmth of his grip steadied her trembling legs as she rose to her feet. And when she finally looked out at the faces before her, she realized some of them were already softening. Some even looked like they were fighting back tears. Standing there beside the pastor, Anna felt exposed in a way she hadn't been in years. The high ceiling of the church seemed to stretch endlessly above her, the stained glass windows casting colored light that danced across the pews. It was beautiful, but she could barely feel it. Her focus was on the weight in her chest, on the uncertainty of what would happen next. The pastor's voice was calm but carried to every corner of the sanctuary. "We all know what it is to be judged. We all know what it is to make mistakes, to stumble, to fall short. But sometimes we forget that grace is not just a word, it's an action." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And it's an action we are called to extend to each other." Anna's eyes darted across the room. She saw Mrs. Carter, the woman who had always sat 2 rows behind her, looking down at her hands, her lips pressed together as if in thought. She saw Mr. Daniels, who had once greeted her every Sunday with a warm handshake, now leaning forward slightly, listening more intently. Her throat tightened again. She wanted to tell them she hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that the truth was far more complicated than the whispers. But instead she stayed silent, sensing that this wasn't the moment to defend herself. It was the moment to let something bigger happen. The pastor turned to her and said softly, "You don't have to speak. Just let them see you here in the light, not hiding." It felt strange to think of it that way. But as she stood there, she realized he was right. For so long, she had been defined by absence, by the empty seat she left behind, by the silence she kept. Now, her very presence was its own kind of defiance against the shame that had followed her. And in that quiet defiance, she felt the first hint of strength returning. The pastor let the moment breathe, giving space for the congregation to see her, not as a rumor, not as a mistake, but as a person. The hush in the sanctuary wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt intentional, as if the stillness itself was part of what was happening. Anna shifted slightly, her hands clasped in front of her. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, the heat in her cheeks beginning to fade. She didn't know what the pastor planned next, but she sensed it wasn't going to be about punishment or shame. Finally, he spoke again, his voice warm but steady. "Every one of us has stood where she stands now. If not in front of a congregation, then in front of life itself. We've all faced moments where the weight of our past threatened to crush us. And in those moments, what saved us wasn't judgment. It was mercy." Anna felt the words press gently against something inside her, loosening the knot she had carried for months. "I don't believe," the pastor continued, "that God calls us to be the voice of accusation in each other's lives. He calls us to be the voice of hope." He turned to her, and for the first time since she had been called back, there was the faintest hint of a smile in his expression. "You still have a place here, Anna, if you want it." The words washed over her like warm sunlight. She had been bracing herself for rejection, for a final push that would send her out the door for good. Instead, she had been given an invitation, a choice. And in that moment, with dozens of eyes watching, she realized the decision was already made. She wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. Anna felt her legs grow steadier beneath her. The knot in her stomach didn't vanish, but it loosened enough for her to breathe. She gave the faintest nod, unsure if her voice would hold if she tried to speak. The pastor's gaze softened further, and he stepped back just enough to give her the space to stand on her own. "You've been missed," he said, still loud enough for the congregation to hear. "Not because you filled a seat, but because you are part of this family. And when one of us is hurting, we all feel it." Anna blinked, surprised by the tremor in her own chest at those words. She scanned the room again, and this time, instead of seeing suspicion in every face, she noticed something different. A few people were leaning forward. One woman gave her a small, encouraging smile. Even a man she barely knew gave a slow, almost reluctant nod, as if conceding some silent argument within himself. Her thoughts drifted to the weeks before she stopped coming. The gossip in the parking lot, the way conversations had paused when she entered a room. She had assumed every heart here was closed to her. Maybe she had been wrong, or maybe some of them had simply been waiting for permission to open again. The pastor rested a hand lightly on her shoulder and said, "You don't have to share your story today. Healing doesn't happen in one moment, it happens step by step. And sometimes, it begins simply by staying when it would be easier to leave." Those words seemed to settle into her bones. She realized he wasn't asking her to relive her pain right now. He was simply asking her to exist here, in this space, without shame. And for the first time in months, Anna felt the possibility that she could. The pastor stepped aside, leaving Anna in full view of the congregation. At first she wanted to retreat, to sink back into the safety of the pew, but something inside told her to hold her ground. She realized this was not just about her. It was about showing everyone that a person's worth doesn't disappear because of mistakes or whispered stories. A stillness settled over the room, the kind that carried an unspoken question. What happens next? Anna wasn't sure herself. She glanced toward the stained glass window on her right, where sunlight spilled through an image of the prodigal son returning home. The The colors shimmered against the floor, as if reminding her of the truth she had tried to forget, that redemption was possible. Then, slowly, a movement in the crowd caught her eye. Mrs. Carter, the woman who had avoided her for weeks, was rising from her seat. The older woman's steps were measured, her face unreadable. For a heartbeat, Anna braced herself for more coldness. But when Mrs. Carter reached her, she simply took Anna's hand and squeezed it. No words, no questions, just a quiet, steady touch. It was such a small gesture, but it hit Anna like a wave. Her throat tightened, and she blinked rapidly to keep her tears in check. One by one, others began to stand. Some approached her with soft smiles, others with tentative nods, as if acknowledging her place without making a spectacle of it. The pastor didn't speak. He didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. The church that had once felt like a place of exile was now showing her, through simple, human gestures, that she still belonged. And for the first time in a long while, Anna felt the heaviness in her chest begin to lift. Anna's hands were trembling, but not from fear anymore. It was something else, something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. The kind that was fragile but real, like the first warm day after a long winter. The people approaching her didn't try to erase what had happened, and they didn't pretend the past didn't exist. Instead, their quiet gestures seemed to say, "You're still one of us. We see you." She realized that forgiveness, when it was genuine, didn't need grand speeches. It could live in a simple handshake or a silent embrace. One man she barely knew, Mr. Harris, stopped in front of her. His hands were calloused, his voice deep and steady as he said, "Good to see you here." It was only 5 words, but the sincerity in them hit harder than any sermon. Anna found herself nodding, her lips curving into the faintest smile. For weeks, she had rehearsed what she might say if anyone ever gave her the chance to explain herself. But now, standing here, she realized maybe she didn't need to explain everything. Maybe this was enough. For today. The pastor remained nearby, watching without interfering, his presence like a quiet safeguard against the weight that had nearly driven her away. When the small crowd finally stepped back, Anna glanced toward the doors she had almost walked through minutes earlier. The thought of leaving now felt completely different. The cold air outside no longer called to her. It was the warmth in this room that kept her still. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping from a tension she hadn't noticed she was holding. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could picture herself returning next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. The exile she had sentenced herself to had ended, not with an argument, but with a hand on hers and a voice calling her name. As the service wound down, the pastor invited the congregation to join in a final hymn. The familiar melody rose softly at first, then grew, filling every corner of the sanctuary. Anna stood there, uncertain whether to join in. She hadn't sung in this church for months. Her voice felt out of place, almost foreign in the space where it had once been at home. But then Mrs. Carter, still beside her, began to sing. Her voice was thin but steady, and something about it made Anna's chest ache. Without thinking, Anna opened her mouth, her voice shaky at first, but soon weaving into the harmony around her. The sound of it, blending with dozens of others, was like a bridge back to the life she thought she had lost. The words of the hymn spoke of grace, of burdens lifted and hearts made whole. Anna didn't need to force herself to believe them. In that moment, they felt real. The tension in her shoulders eased, and she felt the knot in her throat loosen, as if the music itself was untangling something deep inside. When the hymn ended, the pastor stepped forward again. "We are more than the worst thing we've done," he said simply. "And we are more than the worst thing others believe about us." His eyes met hers briefly, and she knew the words were meant for her, but also for everyone listening. As the people began to gather their things and head for the doors, several paused to touch her arm or offer a quiet, "See you next week." Each small gesture felt like another stone lifted from the weight she carried. Anna realized she had come here today to say goodbye. Instead, She was leaving with something she hadn't expected, an invitation to stay, not just in the building, but in the life she had nearly walked away from. The last of the congregation trickled out, their voices fading into the crisp afternoon air outside. Anna lingered near the front, unsure if she was ready to leave just yet. The sanctuary felt different now, less like a place of judgment and more like a place where something had shifted, however small. The pastor walked over, his steps unhurried. "I'm glad you stayed," he said, his tone calm and sincere. Anna met his gaze and for the first time that day, didn't feel the need to look away. "I almost didn't," she admitted. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of truth. "But, thank you." He smiled faintly. "You don't owe me thanks. Just remember, leaving in pain can close doors that staying in hope might keep open." She thought about those words as she finally stepped toward the exit. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows painted warm patches on the floor. When she reached the doorway, she turned back for one last glance. The pews, the altar, the stained glass, they were the same as they had been that morning. But she was not. Outside, the air was cool, the wind brushing against her face. The walk home felt lighter than it had in months. She didn't know exactly what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing. She would be back, and next time, she wouldn't come in with her head bowed. Because sometimes, all it takes is one voice calling your name to remind you that you're not forgotten. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Share it in the comments below. And if this moment touched you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one.